So I want to welcome everyone to our presentation today, Moving Beyond the Binary with Dr. Charissa Urbano and her special guests, Uli Reinhardt and Tim Allen. We're so glad to have you here today. My name is Scott Ellis, and I'm proud to serve as the Executive Director of Great Lakes Bay Pride, the Great Lakes Bay region's LGBTQ+ resource, education, advocacy, and networking organization. We'll get started with Dr. Urbano. And I do want to make a note that if you have any questions during the presentation, please use the question and answer feature here in Zoom, and we'll be sure to address them during our Q&A portion at the end of today's program. This webinar is being recorded as well as live streamed to the Great Lakes Bay Pride Facebook page. If you need to leave early or want to watch the presentation again at a later time, we'll make sure that the recording is accessible. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Charissa Urbano. She received her doctorate from Ball State University in 1988 after conducting research in developmental genetics. She has since been following the science of variations in sex and gender for over 30 years. She is a longtime member of PFLAG, a past board member of Perceptions, now Great Lakes Bay Pride, and one of the founding members of the Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity Youth Advocacy Council. With that, I want to welcome Dr. Charissa Urbano.
Thank you. Thanks, Scott. It's great to be here and great to share everyone's lunch, or at least lunchtime, with you today. And I have lots to share, as I usually do. So I'm going to try to share my screen now and dive right into the presentation because there's probably 2 hours worth of stuff, and we only have an hour. So what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about moving beyond the binary and bring in my special guests along the way to kind of break things up, and then leave it at least 10 minutes at the end for questions and answers. And as Scott mentioned, if you have questions and answers along the way, just go ahead and throw them in the chat. So I was really excited when Scott asked me to give this talk, and he asked for a headshot. So you saw the headshot, and here's the shot that I really wanted to send him. This is the picture I really wanted to send him. I didn't know if he'd appreciate it or not, but this is like, you know, riding the waves. So he mentioned that I've been doing this sort of thing for about 30 years. I'll call it social justice warrior in my kayak, riding the waves, the ups and downs of, living in a very binary, heteronormative world. And trying to make some progress. So that's what we're going to look at today. In terms of that, I guess I should begin with my own personal journey. It is very personal, and it did begin way back when. I always did love biology. As a kid, I was reading the books that my father had on the bookshelf, especially the Time Life series. But my interest was really piqued in human variation on my first visit to an OBGYN. And I guess I was probably about 20 years old. And I learned for the very first time ever, had no idea that I had been DES exposed. DES is diethylstilbestrol. It's a synthetic sex hormone. And, there are no outward signs, so I had no idea. There were some inward signs, though, and that's what my OBGYN noticed. DES then became known as a teratogen, and teratogens are agents that cause birth defects. Basically, in the case of DES, it greatly increases the risk for cervical cancer in female offspring, and also can modify internal reproductive organs and development. So we'll talk, that's how I got my interest in developmental genetics. So that kind of informed my research. Here's one of my research publications. I worked on mice. Here are a couple of my cute little fetal mice. You're looking at a mouse with exencephaly, so missing part of the brain and the cranium, the protective part of the brain. And so, in humans, the equivalent is called anencephaly. But basically, I did research in developmental genetics and have been interested in this topic ever since. Became an educator at Delta College. So many of you know me as professor of biology for 33 years now at Delta, just getting ready to retire. In that time, I took this special interest in SOGI topics, sexual orientation and gender identity, and infused them where appropriate into some of my courses, and actually developed new courses so that there would be more opportunities to talk about cutting edge topics such as this. So exploring diversity was one of the earlier courses that I developed, basically for social science or humanities credit, can also be taken for educational credit. And now I'm teaching biology, genes, and behavior, which is Bio 199. And we have an entire module dedicated to SOGI topics from a biological perspective. So, Scott and I talked about what we could do with this seminar and what to talk about. And basically, I came up with 3 questions that I thought would be important to address. And so we're going to go through those 3 questions, and then we're going to call in our guest speakers in between. So the first question is, how do we move beyond the binary? And that's a very, very tough question. We certainly won't be able to answer it in this 1-hour webinar, but we can begin with what I think is a very important point, and that's to ensure or help educate the population that gender and sex are not equal. Gender and sex are not equivalent. So gender, we can define gender in a lot of different ways, but basically we're talking more or less about a social construct. And the big thing about gender is we are learning that it's not as binary as many of us would have been led to believe. And in fact, if we look at ancient times, they didn't think in terms of binaries as much as we do today either. For instance, Plato in the Symposium talked about 3 genders. And those 3 genders in search for their identity. And so we could go back to ancient times and talk about the fact that gender is just really a cultural, social construct. We have been led to believe that it's simply male, female, cis, trans, masculine, feminine. And what I'm saying here is that even our language reflects our binary thinking. It's very difficult to move beyond the binary if our language is totally binary, this or that. So that's one of the points that I think we need to start with. And then if we're talking about the difference between gender and sex, sex is the biological sex. And that's not as easy as black and white, male and female either. So biological sex is a very complex multi-step process that involves at least 4 major stages. Those major stages involve chromosomes, and this is where most people stop. They stop with chromosomes. If I get an XY, I'm a male. If I get an XX, I'm a female. And that does happen at the moment of conception, but that's not always the case. So we do have XX males, and we do know and have evidence of XY females. And in my talk on Transgender 101, I spent a lot more time talking about the biology of how this can happen. There's lots and lots of variation. So most people just stop on that first step. It all comes down to chromosomes. No, then those chromosomes impact internal genitalia and how that develops. And that happens during the first trimester. And then external genitalia under the control of the hormone dihydrotestosterone. And then finally, brain differentiation. And that's throughout prenatal development. And really for brain differentiation, I should say throughout life. So genes play a role, chromosomes, obviously, and hormones. So it's a very complex process that we'll touch on just a little bit today, because that's not the focus of today's talk. Okay, so let's go back to that idea of gender being cultural. I would like to recommend this website. This is a website put together by PBS, so you can find it on pbs.org. Independent Lens does an excellent job. It's very interactive, so you could point to any one of these pinpoints on the world map and gain more information about different genders, 3rd genders, 2-spirit individuals. The focus of this Independent Lens series was 2-spirit individuals, Native American and First Nation people that actually are 2-spirit, meaning male and female, all in one body. And the good news about these 3rd gender cultures is that in many cases, they're esteemed. These folks are thought of as being able to relate to both their masculine and feminine sides. So just some examples. Let's see, I'm going to have to move my little cursor here so I can see the whole thing. The Mahu tribe, which is indigenous Hawaiian, the indigenous Hawaiian tribe that has a third gender. Moxe is Mexican, mostly Oaxaca, very recognized in Oaxaca as a typically born male, but take on a very female feminine role in the family. Hijras from India. So all of these are points on this interactive map, which is not interactive on this website, but I'd really encourage you to go to the site and investigate for yourself. The Bakla of the Philippines have developed their own language that's beyond the binary. Ladyboys from Thailand. There's some excellent Netflix documentaries. Fa'afa'in are often referred to as Samoan. They actually have legal identity in Polynesia. And the two-spirit individuals that you see, each of the pinpoints in the United States and in Canada are referring to those Native American or First Nation people who identify as two-spirit. And then, my favorite here is Guavedoses. And Guavedoses is more of a biological entity or intersex. Guavedoses would be labeled as intersex. These are individuals who are born female, looking female, assigned at birth female, and then because of an enzyme deficiency, 5-alpha reductase, they actually develop a penis at 12, or develop a penis at 12 is what that word Guavedoses means. So that particular there's two places in the world where this happens more commonly. It's a very rare genetic condition, and that's the Dominican Republic and Papua New Guinea. But in those tribes, this has happened enough times over the generations that they embrace these individuals instead of condemning them. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. All right, so beyond the binary, as I've said, has been either culturally promoted, or in the case of Dr. Ann Fausto Sterling, she was one of the first scholars. She's a biologist and historian. One of the first scholars, I'm going to hold up her book called Sexing the Body, to say that two sexes are not enough. She actually proposed 5 based on what was known back in the day. She was mostly publishing back in the early, I would say, 70s and 80s. And this particular screen capture is from 2001. We are making some progress. In the United States, there's at least 14 states, including Michigan and Washington, D.C. and New York City, that offer gender neutral, non-binary designations on driver's license and IDs. And worldwide, that includes Australia, Canada, India, Germany, New Zealand, Portugal, the Netherlands, and that list is growing. So we are moving. But of course, up and down those waves, we're riding the waves. And I just went the wrong way. So let me go back and try that again. Okay. So, I mentioned that, biological sex is very complex, and that we don't want to spend a lot of time here. So I purposely put this slide up here because it's a very complex slide. And the only point I want to make is the complexity. I'd be happy to do another webinar sometime. You can put your comments in the chat if you'd like to hear that webinar, more about these developmental pathways. Again, it's beyond just XY chromosomes and XX chromosomes. And really it boils down to that SRY gene, which is a master switch gene that you see in the middle of this graphic. But then what does that master switch gene do? It turns on and off a whole bunch of other genes, specifically, or including SOX9, which then goes and turns on and off a whole bunch of other genes. And this is a complex biochemical cascade that occurs during development. We could talk about the variations that can occur. First of all, let's kind of focus in on all the genes. So SRY targets 3,083 targets for the SRY gene. SOX9 targets 1,903. I'm not going to get into the complexity because that's a whole nother talk. And we could talk about all these variations, which I do in my seminar that usually takes about 4 hours. So if you're interested, be happy to do it in another talk. What I want to do is move on and talk about some of the things that Scott and I discussed last week when we were talking about the webinar coming up. And one of the things that's in the media right now, and that's girls sports. I was a Division I athlete, so that right away it appealed to me, Scott, that we might talk about, that you wanted me to talk a little bit more about girls in sports. And currently there's a bill in the Michigan Senate that's looking at barring trans female athletes or restricting their access to athletics. And one of the points that I'd like to make is that, first of all, we've been making the point that it's polygenic. It's many genes that are involved and many hormones that are involved in the developmental pathway to male versus female. And so that would show continuous generation or continuous variation in a population. And here we're looking at 2 different graphics. So if we focus first on the white background, this is salivary testosterone levels in females versus males. And you see that continuous variation. What you see is a bimodal distribution. This is what you would expect, right? And again, a couple of things we could say is that the females are more tightly distributed here. Males more broad in terms of testosterone variation. Now, what's really interesting, but you see overlap also. So right here, we see that there's overlap between both males and females. If we go over to this other testosterone, we're looking at endogenous testosterone histogram for male and female elite athletes. So this is 693 elite athletes. And again, you see the same bimodal distribution. You see the same females tighter versus more variation in males. But look at these elite male athletes and high testosterone levels. But maybe more importantly, check this out. Look at females that are in the testosterone range with males. And my argument would be, all the way to the very end, my argument would be that this is in many cases what makes elite female athletes. And, maybe I would put Serena Williams way over here on the far end. So, excluding trans athletes from participation in girls athletics doesn't have a biological basis. Okay, so many of you that have an interest in this topic have probably seen these 2 graphics. I put them together on the same slide. This is the multi-dimensions of gender. So when we talk about complexity, we really need to break it down. And when I unpack it in my 4-hour seminar, I like to do this as an activity. I'm just throwing it at you as a picture today, but I would rather do it as an activity where everybody reflects on the differences between their gender identity, their gender expression, their biological sex, and their sexual orientation. We don't have enough time to do that today. I just want to point out that I think both of these are great teaching tools. And I think that really understanding dimensions of gender have to begin with people understanding the differences of these multi-dimensions of sex and gender. And then there's different things about the gender-bred person and the gender unicorn that I like. So in the gender-bred person, I like the fact that, gender-bred would imply a cookie, right? You got to put all the ingredients in there in the right time and bake it the right way. But no matter how many times you do that, the cookie's always going to come out different. And that's absolutely the truth. And then gender identity is in the brain. Orientation is in the heart. Your sex is really looking at your reproductive organs, and your expression is how you express yourself. So I like that graphic does a really good job with each one of those. What I really like about the gender unicorn, and this one, by the way, was put together by trans students. So I like the fact that it was put together by students to begin with, and trans students specifically, is that it's a unicorn and it's unique. It's very, very rare, right? Unicorns are very, very rare and very, very unique. And I'd like to imply have special powers. Okay, so moving on, let's look at what the media, the media today. And this is like me collecting cover stories. So, trans and non-binary has been a cover story for at least a decade now. So this has been a hot media topic for the last decade. The Gender Revolution from National Geographic did an excellent job with the cultural perspectives. Made the first Time magazine with Laverne Cox on the cover. I love the subtopics. America's Next Civil Rights Frontier. Scientific American, excellent article that looks at the science and the biology behind gender. And then Time magazine again on the cover. Beyond he or she, a new generation is redefining the meaning of gender. And that's absolutely true. There are gender differences, and the new generation, or the younger people, are leading the way. And then because of those conversations beginning to happen, and because of moving society in a new direction, this happened yesterday, which I think is very exciting. Dr. Rachel Levine, as the highest trans elected politician. So exciting news. All right, so if we come back to our topic of, how do we shift the binary, really it's evolving. And what the evidence that it's evolving is our evolving language. So the language has been evolving and growing and hard to keep up with, to tell you the truth. But what that language really does is it demonstrates our growing knowledge. So this is the trans umbrella. And by the way, I have to give a shout out to Trevor and Robin, who did a webinar, last month, and did a very excellent job talking about trans inclusive language. And we could spend a whole webinar on this, but they did such a good job. I'm going to move on and talk about how this is just a growing example of our knowledge and shifting our paradigms. For instance, in 1994, the DSM described gender identity disorder. It was a disorder. Gender identity was a disorder. And in 2013, it's not a disorder. Gender dysphoria. And there's still problems. We're still evolving this language, but the paradigms are shifting. Okay, if we come back to that idea of athletics, I grabbed this screenshot. This is the fact that across the country, there's a lot of differences, again, just different policies in terms of including transgender, non-binary, and gender non-conforming students. So everywhere from the yellow, which is a policy that supports participation by trans athletes. I guess this is at the K through 12 level. The pink or fuchsia policies that discriminate against trans athletes, and then those states that have no public policies. So, just some of the fact that, across the country, we're in all different places. And so at this point, I'd like to pause for a second and invite my esteemed colleague, Tim Allen, to make some comments and tell part of his story. Tim? I don't know if Scott has to give
Sorry, I had to unmute myself there for a minute. Before I do that, Charisse, there is a question pending, I see. So maybe you want to answer that before that gets too far along and we forget about that.
Okay, I'm not.
Testosterone levels. It's in the Q&A part.
I'm not going to pull those up because I've got too many things on going on.
Okay, no problem. Okay, so first off, my child is going to be 30 years old this July. Kelsey was an athlete in school. Kelsey spent a lot of time in studies and athletics. Didn't spend a whole lot of time dating girls or anything of that nature, which, didn't alarm us at all because Kelsey was very busy with things. Then, Kelsey told us later in life as an adult that she always had a feeling that she was identified as a girl. By the time she was 13, she completely realized that. However, Kelsey hid it from the world very well. Kelsey was an outstanding student at Alma College, graduated second in class. As soon as Kelsey graduated from school, Kelsey went to Reno, Nevada, and started working for Apple Computer, or Apple Corporation, or whatever it's called now, in their leadership program. Then after a year of that, got a job with government and has been in that position since. Kelsey, as I said, hid this from us quite well. Maybe not as well as we think, but it seemed like it. Kelsey came from a background that, my wife and I were Catholic. I say were. And I think that the problem with society and many points of view on this is that in our area that we live in Bay County, it's very binary oriented. And I think that part of that has to do with our faith background in Bay County. Bay County is a very Catholic oriented city to this day, perhaps evangelic to a point now. And I think that has a lot to do with it. When Kelsey told us about this, we had very mixed emotions at first. I went down and I talked to Charissa down in Ann Arbor. Her and I had a few beers and we had some really good food at a distillery, I believe it was, or something like that, maybe a tap room. I don't remember exactly where it was. And we had a very good chat. And I think that at that moment, I had some growing to do in my acceptance. And my whole experience with this has grown, and I've become very enriched by this whole thing, to be quite honest with you. And my purpose is really to help people like me who struggled with this idea. I mean, I was completely allied to the LGB part of the LGBTQ plus community. I never really thought about T all that much. And I think many people that I know don't see it as a real thing or as a valid thing. They see it as a mental illness or whatever. And then when Charissa explained the biology, you realize it makes sense in a lot of ways. The biology all leads to the possibility of this. And I think that's important to understand. And so when she really hits the idea home of a non-binary society, really that is what we are. And I think that all people have to understand that. One of the things that some of my LGB friends often tell me is that, well, even in the LGB community, transgender is not well understood. And I think that we all need to understand it better. At the moment, as far as athletics is concerned, as I said, Kelsey was a great athlete. Kelsey, her junior year, sometimes I get that still mixed up. Her junior year, she ran a marathon. I believe it was in Grand Rapids, but I'm not sure, and qualified for Group B of the Olympic trials as a male athlete. Of course, Kelsey never pursued that. That was in 2011 for the 2012 Olympic trials, marathon trials. Kelsey often tells me that she has no interest in athletics anymore. She plays some tennis in Reno because that was a sport that she never took up as a kid. And she says she's not very good at it. But that's not the reason why. And we have long discussions when we visit with Kelsey about this. And Kelsey's philosophy is that she just doesn't feel competitive about it any longer. That said, I was also a national class cyclist as a child, not as a child, but as a young adult, I guess, 18, 19, 20 years old, under 21 national class cyclist. And, my attitude is that, if a person who is cisgender male says that he wants to participate in athletics as a female, that really isn't happening. If people are participating who are transgender in female athletics, who are male at birth, assigned male at birth, that isn't because they want to win. It's, from our experiences, my family's experiences, it's far too difficult of a lifestyle to just choose. And that's really all I have to say. Thank you, Charisse.
Thank you, Tim. Yeah, thank you. I wanted to threw in this next slide because Tim and Lisa, friends of mine, have been very affirming and have embraced Kelsey and Kelsey's transition. And I think that that's very, very important. Now, it wasn't that they did this easily because the Catholic faith, I know we've had these discussions, that became part of the issue. And I had some of these same issues growing up. I was raised in a traditional Catholic home. And my mantra growing up was, I'm going to hell, I'm going to hell, I'm going to hell. These are very important, points to understand that as families affirm and embrace, that suicide risk goes way down. So when I first saw this graphic, I was blown away. Trans teens whose families reject them are at 58% higher risk of suicide. I mean, we have lives to save out there, and that's what it's all about, as Tim mentioned. So we're ready for our second question, and we'll come back on all of these. I'm sorry, I can't see the chat right now, and I'm going to just leave it to the end. And Scott will help us with that, but I'm going to just keep going ahead, and then we'll come back to the questions. So why is progress so controversial? Many, many reasons. I'm teaching diversity for all these years. Where do you start and where do you stop? I mean, I'm going to talk a little bit about xenophobia, and that's the origin of transphobia, homophobia, racism, sexism, all the isms. Fear of things that are different, minority oppressions. We could talk about the microaggressions that happen every single day to people who are GLBT, especially to T. The discrimination that happens, the higher risk for losing their job, homelessness, the lack of safety, the fear of homicide, the number of especially people of color, trans women of color, who have been murdered. Cognitive bias. We'll talk a little bit about worldviews. And of course, cognitive bias also is greatly influenced by the media bubbles that you surround yourself with and the echo chambers that you live in. We could do a whole talk about that alone. So I'm only touching on things here. A lack of exposure. Lots of people still saying, I don't even know a trans person. I've never met a trans person in my life. That is an important thing. The very first time I spent time with a trans person, I understood it at a whole different level. Religious dogma that we've been mentioning. Conservatives believe they're in a culture war right now. So this is a big deal, and it's a very divisive issue. It's also been a very divisive issue in some religions. Some religions are moving towards and are already welcoming, but others are dividing. Being divided because of it. And then, bottom line is even the experts don't agree. Even the experts don't agree. The DSM has changed. The WPATH, which is the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, has their standards of care. The DSM has slightly different norms. And then there's a movement out of California, which is a gender affirming model, which is saying, they're all saying similar, but slightly different things. So let's talk and start with, go back to xenophobia for a second. So this is, that's me. And I am in a Xena costume back in the days of Xena. And when I was younger and could pull it off, which I can't do today. And this was my entry into diversity work. And I was recruited by one of our administrators to help do a seminar for other faculty and staff, basically. And in beginning that seminar and starting to talk about diversity and including what I call big D diversity. So including all diversity, not just race, class, and gender, but also sexuality and orientation and gender issues. I was met with a lot of resistance by my colleagues, believe it or not, and go figure. And so I had, the second time back, I had to come with my Xena costume is how this happened. So we have a fear of those who are different. We have tribal tendencies built right in. I mean, evolutionarily, they're probably built right in instinctively to us as survival skills. So the only way to overcome those tendencies, those natural tendencies to be protective, family first, is through education and exposure. So, education's been my mission since then. But the crux of the issue probably boils down to this: whether or not you can even see a spectrum. Is it a gender binary or is it a spectrum of variation? And I call this the box versus the continuum dilemma. So the box versus continuum dilemma, I believe, is also built in, and there's evidence, there's research articles that would support the idea that our brains are different. And our brains come somewhat, formed to either have a preference for black and white or have a preference for seeing and understanding shades of gray. And so this kind of permeates, the way we see the world and shapes our worldview. Lots of folks have a fear-based worldview. Other folks have an evidence-based worldview. So what I'm trying to say here is this is a really difficult dilemma because we're talking about people whose brains work and see and understand the world differently. And we're trying to move them beyond a binary that they just can't buy into. So this shapes our cognitive bias. My cognitive bias, I know, is evidence-based worldview as a scientist. And I began to see those shades of gray when I went away to college. And I would go back home to a traditional Catholic family, and my father saw things black and white all the way to the day he died. And we used to have, once I started going away to college, we used to have some deep, dark discussions that actually used to turn into arguments just because we couldn't understand each other's worldview, black and white, gray. So, we've got a lot of work to do, and it's gonna need to be gentle, gracious, and understanding both sides of this particular dilemma that, our cognitive bias shapes our worldview. The good news is there's, here's a great example of paradigm shifts do happen when methods and beliefs are incompatible with new knowledge. And, as LGBT folks, especially, but LGBTQ, as all of us got on the mission to be part of the advocacy of same-sex marriage, look at what happened to public opinion. So really, as folks came out of the closet, public opinion's been flipped in 30 years. And so, we're in a much better place today. I remember, back for me, it really happened back with AIDS. A big shift occurred with AIDS when I started seeing media reports and images of silence equals death. I decided I can't stay in the closet. Silence equals death. And that's how enough folks came out of the closet, became advocates, became recruited allies, and we made this shift happen. So it can happen. So at this point, I'm going to pause again because I want to stay on task and on time here and hand it over to my pickleball playing friend, Uli.
All right. Thanks, everybody. And I came and got myself a helper here. Here, meet Princess. He's been sitting on my lap for the whole time, giving me emotional support. Princess, say hello to people. And Princess is not only my COVID pal, but also he is a good teaching tool because I named him Princess for a reason. And he is actually male. I could show you the lower part of him as a proof. So I'm introducing him to introduce kind of this issue of that gender is not what you think it is. And there is no such thing as binary. And why cannot a male dog be called a princess? It really throws some people off. I have a colleague at work who was going, princess, but he's a boy. So anyways, I get a great laugh out of it, but also I sometimes get people thinking a little bit. And most of the time, queer people, they get it right away. They think that's a great name. Anyways, I just want to give you a little bit about my story, trying to make it short. But in brief, it's a story of privilege and challenges and mixed in some joy as well. And the privilege was really the first 50 years of my life. I grew up in Germany. I was cis het white male. So born as assigned male at birth, thinking I was male, heterosexual, white, upper middle class family, happy family, good student. Things were rolling around beautifully. And I went through grad school, met my beautiful future wife in grad school, got a PhD, had a postdoc, moved to America, got a professorship. Now I'm a tenured professor. raised a beautiful child, lived in a leafy neighborhood in Ann Arbor, and life was really good. And I was enjoying a lot of privilege without even being aware of it at all. And that's a very strange thing about privilege. You don't really know it unless you lose it. And losing my privilege started really after my divorce. But before the divorce, I had, as I said, I was 40, 45 or so, and everything was rolling along smoothly. And I had no idea that something was inside me kind of slowly brewing. So unlike Tim, whose daughter knew that she was a female early on, I had no idea. I really did not. I was a happy, quote unquote, normal white male. And then, I'm going to spare you the details, but again, it was an ugly divorce. I had a new partner. She kind of pulled it out of me that indeed I was not a man. I could not continue living as a man. I turned into a woman. And it must have been there before, but I just wasn't aware of it. And ever since, for the last 2 years, I've been living as a woman. I came out to my son, I came out to my family, I came out at work about 2 years ago. And I was lucky. Most people, well, pretty much everyone accepted me for what I am. And not everyone understands it. My father, for example, really doesn't understand it, but he accepts it. But one of the biggest differences now is that I, as a woman, living as a woman, as a transgender woman, and presenting female, apart from definitely my voice and my height, I'm 5'11", presenting as a female, but I can't pass as a female, and I'm not sure whether I want to. I want to be accepted as who I am with my voice and everything, and being very athletic and things like that. But what I learned is fear that I didn't have before. Before I would take trips to, solo trips to Nicaragua for a week of surfing in a camp in Nicaragua. I wouldn't think twice about it. I can't do this anymore. I used to go a new place and there's a pub. I go into that pub and, being confident that I'll be having a great time. Now I stand in front of the pub and I'm scanning the environment, are there a lot of pickup trucks there? Ooh, can I really go in there? Will there be some drunken asshole who hassles me or stares at me, or people making bad comments, or will they even beat me up or rape me? Who knows? I haven't experienced any of that. I mean, I live in Ann Arbor. Ann Arbor is a great place for queer people, and people around me are really nice to me, but I am living in constant fear of, the first thing to have, bad thing to happen to me. And it could just be a microaggression. Well, microaggressions come all the time. People misgender me all the time, including myself, sometimes even so. But the big thing is here that I entered involuntarily, because I really couldn't do anything about it. I fell from a privileged group to a marginalized group in America. And that made me realize of how privileged I had really been before. And now, people hate me. I shouldn't go to online forums and read if there's an article about transgender people. The hate that pours out is quite astonishing. Now I understand how women feel when there's drunken guys kind of hitting on them. I understand much better understand now how people of color feel being in constant threat of violence, when you get stopped by police, by a cop somewhere on a country road, how is that cop going to treat me? I understand how people of color feel on an everyday basis. So I want to leave you with that, is that we have gone far in this country and changes are coming rapidly, but still is the fear, and in order to overcome this fear, we as a society have to change a whole lot more. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, Uli. Thank you very much. Well, that brings us to our third question, and it also brings us to the crux of the issue that I knew we were going to get into, and that's time. So I want to thank Uli for making the point that, it's not going to be just trans folks who can do this work. In fact, they're not the ones that can do it because it's not that safe for them. and they don't have the privilege. So, what can we do to build a safer and more inclusive community? Just a whole lot of things. And I just listed a few. We're going to run out of time here, and I want to save time for questions and answers. So I might ask Scott to do is, Scott, how do you feel about doing another follow-up webinar with just this question? Or should we continue or try to plow through?
Let's take just about 2 minutes on this, and then we can move into question and answer.
Okay. All right. So what I had wanted to do is talk about comprehensive legal reforms and recognize the generational differences, which we can do really quickly. To talk about all hands on deck, it's going to take allies and advocates and social justice warriors. We all need to become social justice warriors. And then I wanted to share with you some resources. So it's going to take collaboration. It's going to take all of us working together. And part of that collaboration is happening now in the Great Lakes Bay Area, and I'm really excited about that. And that's the collaboration between Great Lakes Bay Pride, which you see their website there, and I think Scott has it in the chat, and SOGIAC, the group that I've been working with. So Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity Youth Advocacy Council is SOGIAC, and we just opened I'm going to flip through a whole bunch of these. We just opened this website. It was just published yesterday. It's the new and upgraded version of our website. We focus mainly on youth. And so we have been looking at developing some resources that anyone in the community can use. These are free resources. And Scott has the website, and here's the one specifically for the toolkits. We've spent the last year developing these toolkits. And basically what the toolkits are one page actually they're either PDF versions or online. You can go online and actually pull one of these up. And there are links to all kinds of information and resources regarding the topic. So what to do when my child comes out. Understanding gender is one of the ones that I put together. The nature and nurture debate. And we worked as a team. So almost every member of SOGIAC contributed a different toolkit. But each toolkit comes with 30 or 40, up to 20 to 30 links that will take you to more information, ranging from a glossary of terms to recommended reading, to research articles, to websites, to videos, just a little toolkit that's going to help you get through a crisis if your family is confronted for the first time with the idea of a child who is grappling with gender. So I would like to offer those and ask and encourage you to go and check those out yourself and give us some feedback on those, because this is a brand new thing and we're open to feedback. And then one more thing I'll point out is that if any of you are working with schools, I work with some very talented people at SOGI, at the Youth Advocacy Council. And one of them is Amy Canos. So her name is down here, and I want to give Amy credit. By the way, I want to give Sean McDonald credit for getting that website up in time for this talk today. But I want to give Amy credit. Amy has for this particular graphic, and actually this is an interactive website that you could go to with that link or get to off the SOGIAC site. And Amy has a master's in public health and is a data guru, the data collection and analysis. And then she put together this brainchild where taking research from the Michigan school headcount, and then research from a study that was done throughout the state that revealed that 14.9% of high school students identify as gay, lesbian, and bisexual, or are unsure of their sexual identity, and 1.8 self-identify as transgender. And then taking that data, those statistics, and applying it to head counts per school. And here we're just looking at one little pinpoint here where I blew Freeland up. So this is Freeland. The number of students in that school is 873. And if you apply those statistics, you would estimate there to be 130 gay and lesbian and bi students and 16 trans students, many of which are probably struggling with or not out. And so this would just give you data for any school district in the state of Michigan in terms of numbers. So let's see what else we have. I'm going to stop here and open it to questions and answers. How's that?
Thanks so much, Charisse. So let me, I'll run through the questions here in the order that we have them, and we'll answer as many as we can in the last few minutes here. The first question has to do with the graphic that you presented earlier about the testosterone levels. And the question was really about the date that the one chart was published, and what are your thoughts about, has that changed over time, or would you expect that distribution to still be the same?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. And I'm sorry, I mean, in my haste, I didn't put in references and dates for all of the graphics that I included in the presentation, but I would say that it's going to be variable depending on the population that's surveyed. So that was one population, and in the one graphic that had the white background, I didn't even have an N on the screen, and I'd have to go back to the original data to find that N. So, but what it shows us is a bimodal distribution. That's going to be consistent throughout all populations, and it doesn't matter what years. So if they're referring to the testosterone levels, I don't think that that's going to be variable. So maybe I need some more clarification on that, but it depends on population. But tendencies are, the graphics of a bimodal distribution for males and females, and overlapping is the main point there.
Yeah, great, thank you. Our next question, it says, Dr. Urbano, will you address the terminology assigned at birth? My understanding is this is a procedure when an infant is born visibly intersexed and a surgical intervention assigns a sex. But is assigned at birth kind of being used interchangeably or conflated with identified or labeled as a specific gender at birth? Is that?
Yeah, again, I think that's evolving. The language is evolving. I mean, assigned at birth, really, Anne Fausto Sterling talked a lot about this in her book, and this book was written long ago. And that's the fact that we assign, and it's really the doctor delivering the baby, looking at the phallus, saying, is that phallus more than, and there used to be a measurement, is that phallus more than 3, I don't know what the measurement is, let's say 3 inches, or that would be too big. But anyways, is it more than such and such? And then we're going to assign it as we're going to assign it because it has a very small phallus, an extra small phallus or a micropenis. We're going to assign it as a female because it's going to be easier for those parents to raise this baby as a female. And then there's another famous study by John Money where they actually took a young boy who was a twin, and because he had botched surgery at circumcision, they burned off the penis. The penis was damaged, and John Money, and of course this is the leading researcher in gender at the time from Johns Hopkins University, said it's just better to raise him as a girl. And so that became the John story that's in psychology books, and later became known as I like to call it the Bruce Brenda David story, because, born Bruce, assigned at birth as a male, wasn't, because of genitalia size, and then converted to a female, Brenda, but never, did well as a female, and really refuted that gender assignment, and then reverted back to a male, and eventually committed suicide, because we're talking about a whole lot of trauma there. So assigned at birth really just means what it says, assigned at birth. What do we see and how do we assign? And now the way that the medical community is dealing with intersex has changed significantly now. So usually if there is ambiguous genitalia, a micropenis or an enlarged clitoris, that typically what happens now is that there is no sex assigned at birth. They'll wait. So it's complicated because it does vary, and even the experts don't agree. But I would say that assigned at birth is a term that people use just to say this is what people decided based on what they saw in terms of genitalia.
Great, thank you for that question.
I would let Uli join in on that one if you want. Do you have anything else to add to that? Okay, go ahead.
Our next question says, how can we help youth, especially before puberty, differentiate for themselves between their gender non-conforming behavior and actually being transgender?
Okay, that's a great question. And I wish I had the book sitting in front of me, but there is I like to use in my seminar a book that's put out by the gender affirming, and in fact, the title of the book is Gender Affirming Model. And that gender affirming model is coming out of folks in California and across the country, but mainly out of the West there, that gender affirming, they're identifying these children as what they call TGE, transgender and gender expansive. So they're trying to distinguish, they're looking for distinguishing features between those that are transgender, those young children that identify early, or those that are gender expansive and identify a little bit later on. And then what are they saying? What language are they using? They actually have assessment tools built right into the book, the gender affirming model, that will help the child with a counselor work through these issues. So here's what happens for the children who are transgender. They begin identifying earlier, because gender doesn't have to do with puberty and hormones at puberty. So they identify usually between the ages of 2 and 4. And those children will use language that's very specific. I am a girl. I am a boy. Versus gender expansive children use language differently. They use terms like, I would like to be a boy, or I want to play with a boy, or I want to do the things that the boys do, or I want to dress like a boy, which is very different language than saying emphatically, I am a boy. The other thing that they've pointed out, and I think the part of the model that I really love, is they try to differentiate between trans and gender expansive. So they use the acronym TGE, and they're going on 2 different paths. And the GE people, the gender expansive people, actually move along that pathway later, than 2 to 4 years of age. So for instance, I didn't have any feelings of being a lesbian when I was 2 or 4 or 5, or I don't think back and think anything about that. What I think about is more when I got to puberty, sexual orientation, after I started thinking about opposite sex, or in my case, the same sex. So, there's 2 different trajectories. They're saying different things. They're using the language very differently, even as a child, without knowing what that language really fully means. The next thing I want to say is the next acronym in that book that's very important is PIC, persistent, insistent, and consistent. So trans children are persistent in the fact that they aren't in the right body. The body's not aligned with the brain. They are insistent. They insist on it. I am a girl, not I want to be a girl, or I wish I was a girl, or I wish I had a penis. And they're consistent. They say it consistently throughout their childhood. So that's a great resource, and I would look up more on the gender affirming model.
Great, thank you. The next question here, and our last one to wrap up today, is actually for Dr. Reinhardt. The question is, how do you handle knowing that things have changed for you and you have to be more cautious or not as privileged as you were? Could you expand more on that?
Okay, I guess I have to make it short. I don't handle it. Well, I wish I could handle it with great aplomb and being totally self-confident, but my confidence in it is growing very, very gradually. I was much more afraid early on, and I would be even afraid to be on the street during daylight or so. It comes with experience, with positive experience. And it comes with people around me, people who love you, affirming, yes, you are a woman and you are worthy, and you are worthy of being protected and being safe somewhere. So it really is a mixture of what you said, the story you tell yourself, the story that your loved ones tell you, and the story that society tells you. And again, it really depends on the environment. If you live in Ann Arbor, you're good. I don't know what it'd be like in some little, whatever, out of a country place in the boonies. So it'd be hard to grow up. And it also comes with the privilege that you have. I mean, I am still white, I'm still a professor, and I have an easier time than someone who's, let's say, a person of color who might have other traumas playing into their transgender trauma as well.
Thank you for that. Well, with that, we are going to conclude for today. I want to thank our panelists today, and especially Dr. Urbano. Thank you so much for walking us through Moving Beyond the Binary. I am looking forward to us hosting a follow-up. It looks like there's definitely some interest, so we'll continue keeping everyone posted on that. So I hope everyone has a fantastic rest of their day, a great weekend coming up, and we look forward to seeing you all soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.